not personalizing an issue. It is being able to see the systemic interrelationships between different forms of economic injustice. It's a form of conscientization. It's not personalization. Okay? So, additionally, these framing dynamics also say some interesting things about the multiplicity and complexity of frames in social movements. And as I've shown you, there were multiple frames during the day, but some evidence of increasing convergence during that day. And as I said, that emerging democracy frame was sort of like the most inclusive thing that participants could come up with. And I think sort of helps flesh out the idea that you can have sort of local issues interacting pretty dynamically with sort of like global concerns expressed by a global movement, and develop something that works for the people on the ground, that they can sort of use as some kind of negotiating frame to deal with the pretty big political differences between the groups who are forming that day. And finally, in terms of sort of, I guess, sort of theoretical significance, I think this says a couple of interesting things about thin and thick ties in activist organizing, right? So it was thin ties that brought people together, but eventually the ties clearly thickened during the day, yeah? And so it seems to me, I mean, you can go out on a limb and say, well, okay, so the digital environment helps bring people together. It helps produce people in places, right? Which is more than just a networking logic, I think. But it's once people get to the places that they begin to make sense of the issues, right? And begin to actually develop a clear agenda. So when you actually think about all the public criticism about all these occupiers don't know what they're saying and they don't know what they want, well, they didn't at the beginning, but that was something that became clearer and clearer and clearer as the weeks went by. And what they want, by the way, I think differs quite a bit from place to place. So I'll get to that in a second, I think. Or maybe I'll just talk about it right now. The people I've stayed in touch with since that event, about 10 or 15 of them, a lot of folks have started different Occupy groups that seem to be relevant to the Wellington area. So Wellington has a large university, and so a couple of radical students have started Occupy Uni. Okay, Wellington has a large artist community, so a bunch of artists created Occupy Crafts, right? So a lot of Maori activists have actually took the label Occupy and called it Occupy Aotearoa. Right? So again, you can see sort of the really interesting attachment of the word occupy to a whole bunch of like vibrantly local issues, right? I mean, the local issues don't die away. I mean, they still are really important. It's just that they are being connected together in this really loose and flexible way by the word occupy. So I'm going to come back now to what I started with, which is this whole idea of activist dialogue, right? And the new dialogic. So if you can see now that what I call the new dialogic, coordination, consensus, exchange, is a fairly limited way of understanding what activist issues really are, how they coordinate and communicate, and how they actually engage with each other. How then do we understand what activist dialogue is? How do we move beyond connectivity and connection as a way of understanding activist dialogue? So in closing, I just want to reflect on the idea that if considering activist communication in terms of the new dialogic emphasizes a very specific networking logic of connectivity, and if activist communication is altogether more complex, then we have to change what we mean by dialogue. Okay? And so what Heather Zola and I have proposed is that instead of examining dialogue on the fringes of activist work, okay, looking for consensus or collaboration wherever we can find it, we make it more central, okay, and focus on the dialogic potential of activist contestation, and set contestation up itself as dialogic. Okay, so doing so centers openness and reduces the privilege of consensus. Okay, so openness becomes an altogether more important construct, I think. So that's what Heather Zola and I did in our recent comp theory piece. We tried to develop multiple meanings of openness and instead of just thinking of openness as one specific kind of listening. And so there are 4 meanings of openness in that article that we never really fleshed out very coherently in the piece itself, but they are in there. And so I thought I'd close by just talking about that. So one form of activist openness is openness as deliberation. Okay? And that is openness as a kind of communicative explanation, an attempt to establish difference in the face of presumed unity. Right? Presumed unity in consensus, in that sense, is a dangerous form of discursive closure. Right? So if you are, as an activist, attempting to explain injustice, that is an important form of openness because it actually communicates multiplicity and communicates difference in the face of presumed unity. Right? Does that make sense? Right? Second, we understand openness as a kind of pragmatic caution. And by pragmatic caution in practice, I think the term that we ended up using just sort of as a conceptual shortcut was cautious confrontation or cautious cooperation. Right? What this does is prevent cooptation. Right? So even if you decide to cooperate, even if you're the transition movement, for example, and you end up lobbying the city council and hoping that they'll work with you, openness in that sense is manifested by exercising caution and not allowing cooptation. Okay? So, and in practice that might involve alternating contestation with outright contestation with more collaborative practice. A third meaning of openness is understanding openness as a form of unpredictability. Right? Protests have a dialogic and multivocal character themselves. Okay? They have uncertain outcomes for protesters as well as the frames for the issue itself. Okay? So understanding sort of the outcomes of protest itself as a form of openness. And finally, and I guess most obviously, and this is what people have written more about, is openness as a kind of awareness and visibility of the issues itself. The very existence of the Occupy movement, for example, itself helps create cultural discourses and counter-narratives about the inevitability of financial austerity. And that is a very important kind of openness to have. Again, it's something that prevents discursive closure. So what we're trying to say is that dialogic openness can be engendered by all kinds of communicative practices. Those include debates, discussions, struggles, contestations, not just coordination, collaboration, and exchange. Right? It happens in multiple ways. And activist studies in that sense need to continue to do this work to keep understanding and keep unpacking the kind of radical openness that activist organizing continues to potentialize, but not necessarily actualize. So I think I'll stop there. There are a bunch of things that I haven't said, but, this is a lot.